Greetings, and welcome to my presentation on training clinical educators to lead an intra-professional student team. My name's Rodri Purcell, and I'm currently a faculty member in the Doctor of Physical Therapy program, or DPT program, at Rocky Mountain University of Health Professions in Provo, Utah. When I began my coursework at Capella University, I was the Director of Clinical Education for the Physical Therapist Assistant, or PTA, program at Provo College. I'm pleased to present my capstone project for the Doctor of Education program at Capella University. The idea for this project was prompted by a couple of opportunities that I saw in the clinical education programs at both of the institutions where I was employed. First, as seems to be the case with every physical therapy training program, there's always an opportunity to expand the availability of clinical site offerings for students to complete their clinical education experiences. Second, I also saw an opportunity to expand our students' exposure to intra-professional practice during their clinical education experiences. This means exposure to working in a PT-PTA team. I started by conducting a literature review to find a solution that could meet both of these objectives. The review quickly identified collaborative learning as an attractive choice of solutions because it's been proven to increase clinical site availability. But then I also thought that it could be implemented on an intra-professional level to expand students' intra-professional exposure. As I explored collaborative learning as a potential solution, I discovered that most authors recommended that clinical educators should be trained in collaborative learning in order for it to be successful, but very few of these authors discussed how to conduct the training or what content to include. So, I decided that my first step should be to develop a training course for clinical educators on how to implement interprofessional collaborative learning. Since the literature was sparse on the topic of training, I decided to seek input from my local stakeholders, meaning our clinical educators and site coordinators of clinical education, to see what they thought should be in the training. I took an action research-based approach because I really wanted to know what my own clinical educators' opinions were on what this training should look like. This approach helped me to not only gather some excellent input and ideas for training course content, but it also helped me to build local support for the solution, and it ensured that my final product, the training course, would meet the needs identified by my local stakeholders. I started by partnering with my colleagues from the PTA program at Provo College to identify clinical educators that had taken both PTA and DPT students in the past. I thought that these clinical educators would have the best perspective on intra-professional clinical education since they'd seen both kinds of students. Then, I conducted semi-structured interviews with a little over half of those clinical educators that I had identified as being shared by the two institutions. Here's what the interview looked like. If they had previous experience with collaborative learning, I asked what they thought made it successful or unsuccessful so that I could incorporate those lessons learned into the course. Then I asked them specifically what their preferences were regarding content, assessment methods, outcomes, and delivery method. I also asked each person if their setting presented any unique characteristics that would require special training content. After the interviews were completed, I conducted qualitative coding on all of the transcripts and had an independent reviewer do the same. I loosely followed the Quad Squad approach to qualitative coding outlined by Marks in 2015, which included the activities listed in the table on the slide. In open coding, the first activity, the main themes were identified in each interview and color-coded for ease of reference. Then, each occurrence of each theme was counted and tallied in the initial numeric content analysis, the second activity. Next, the recurring themes were grouped and categorized into 4 main concepts that could be used to guide course development. A final numeric content analysis provided a comprehensive look at the recurrence of themes across interviews, and this analysis helped clarify the priorities for course content. Finally, I did what Marks calls caching the gems, to capture quotes from the transcripts that were illustrative of the main themes seen across the interviews. The interviewing and coding process yielded some useful results. First, a lot of the clinical educators' responses aligned with the recommendations from the literature, lending validity to those content areas. But my local stakeholders' responses also pointed to new content areas that I hadn't seen in the literature, relating to the intra-professional component of clinical work, such as how to interact in a PT-PTA team, how to delegate to a PTA, and what the PTA's role and scope are. Surprisingly, many of our respondents felt that they didn't have a good understanding of this content area, so I included it in my course content. Respondents also wanted an online asynchronous delivery, and they identified several assessment methods that they'd prefer. But probably the biggest benefit of this action research approach was that the process of seeking input and collaboration from my clinical partners created stronger relationships with them and generated a lot of excitement and support for the project. I became a big fan of action research during this interview process. The results of the qualitative coding numeric analysis are summarized in this table. All 17 respondents unanimously agreed with the content areas that I had identified from the literature review. These are the first 5 topics listed in the table. You can also see that a majority of respondents preferred the online asynchronous delivery method, but many also liked the idea of an in-person training course. So this might be something to explore in the future. To make the results of the qualitative coding a little more accessible to our clinical educators, I created this infographic and then distributed it to the respondents. With my evidence-based content list in hand, I started developing my training course. I used the interactive program design model published by Caffarella and Daffron in the development phase because it provided a systematic, structured approach to development. I also used Wiggins' backward design method to ensure that my learning activities had a direct link back to my program objectives. And finally, I consulted the literature on best practices for online instruction, since the course would be an exclusively online offering. This table shows the stages of course development and how each stage aligned with the various components of Caffarella's and Daffron's interactive model. For example, the first stage, the content search stage, which included the literature review and interviews with stakeholders, aligned with discerning the context, building a solid base of support, and assessing needs. Instructional plan development came next, and it included the creation of program goals and objectives. These are the program goals and related objectives that guided the development of the instructional plan. These overriding goals and objectives revolved around giving participants the tools and resources they'd need to feel confident in their ability to succeed in leading an interprofessional student team. These goals, coupled with the content list previously developed during the content search stage, provided ample direction for the creation of the actual training course. When it was all said and done, I was able to organize my content into 5 broad categories that became the 5 learning modules of the course. These content areas reflect both local needs as well as recommendations from the literature. I built the course around these 5 areas, making each area its own learning module in the Canvas learning management system. I'll deliver the content using the learning activities listed here. I created several role-play videos as problem-based learning opportunities. In these videos, participants will watch a clinical educator having discussions with his intra-professional student team in several clinical scenarios, and then they'll be prompted to identify best practices as well as poor practices and reflect on how they could improve each of the poor situations. I also used multimedia presentations extensively to appeal to a broad spectrum of learning styles, with short assessments embedded in each presentation to keep participants engaged and interested in the content. I also incorporated some interactive learning activities such as drag and drop and matching to help participants engage with the material. Since adult learners need to see the relevance of any new information that they're learning, I used reflective discussion forums to encourage participants to reflect on how the information relates to their own practice and setting. The next slides provide examples of these various learning activities, including a multimedia presentation, an interactive learning activity, and some examples of reflective discussion questions. Here's a clip from one of the multimedia presentations created through the online platform Powtoon that teaches participants about cooperative learning. In cooperative learning, students divide the tasks of a new or challenging activity and then work together toward a final goal. For example, to complete a patient encounter, one student might perform the history, then the other would perform the tests and measures. This allows each student to avoid cognitive overload by focusing on achieving competency in one portion of the task. They can then switch tasks on the next patient and gradually build their skills to complete an entire patient care session. And here is an interactive drag and drop learning activity created using the H5P software used to teach participants which treatment activities are appropriate for delegation to the PTA and which are not. And as a final example, here are some of the reflective discussion questions included in the course to help participants relate course content to their own experiences. Now that the training course is built, my next step will be to administer it in a pilot study and use the results to further refine and improve the course. I also want to use a similar approach to create a training program for students because many authors recommend that students should also be trained if collaborative learning is to be effective. Once I have both courses developed, I'll implement them locally with all the interested clinical educators here in town, and then I'll assess my outcomes. The outcomes I want to look at initially are the tertiary outcomes listed at the bottom of this table. Namely, how does this type of training affect clinical educators' perceptions of intraprofessional collaborative learning and their confidence in implementing such learning models? Secondly, after clinical educators complete the training, I plan to assess the secondary and primary outcomes listed in the table. I want to see if the training actually results in increased implementation of intraprofessional collaborative learning and if that translates into increased clinical site availability. This will probably require follow-up of at least 1 to 2 years because of the timing of clinical education experiences. While these are the first outcomes I want to address, there are also other lines of inquiry that I think would be fascinating to pursue. First, the list of benefits from collaborative learning in general is well established in the literature, but would these same benefits be realized in an intraprofessional collaborative model? It makes sense that they would, but this should be fleshed out in future studies. Also, does early exposure to intraprofessional collaboration during students' clinical education experiences result in long-term changes in practice, such as higher utilization of PTAs in the clinic, improved PT-PTA team interaction, or improved delegation skills? Both of these would be interesting topics to explore in the future. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Here are the references that I used to make the presentation, and if you're interested in further information regarding intraprofessional collaborative clinical education, please feel free to contact me at the email address listed here. Best wishes to you all.